Have you ever wondered how ancient Romans constructed their homes? Well, in this video we will show you how they did it. From planning to roofing, we will cover all the steps involved in building a simple ancient Roman house. We will also tell you about the tools they used and the materials needed to make it possible. And at the end, we will tell you what to do if you want to build your own Roman house today. But before we begin, click on that subscribe button so you won't miss out on any of our future videos. Step 1. Planning and preparation. Before starting construction on their homes, the Romans would first take some time to plan ahead. They would consider the location, size, and shape of their future house and make sure it would be stable and safe. They would choose a location that had stable ground, accessible water sources, and suitable drainage. They would also measure and mark the boundaries of the house using a groma, an ancient Roman surveying tool for measuring straight lines. The groma consisted of two perpendicular arms, each divided into several equal parts. By using the groma, the Romans could ensure that the walls of the house were straight and true. Step 2. Excavating and laying foundations. Once the site was chosen and the boundaries were marked, the Romans would start excavating the ground. They would use picks called dolabri and shovels to dig shallow trenches for the foundations of the house. The depth of these trenches would depend on the type of soil and the weight of the house. Typically, they would be between 0.5 meter and 2 meters deep. After the trenches were dug, the Romans would fill them with layers of stones and mortar. The stones were usually small and irregular in shape, so they would fit closely together and create a solid base. The mortar was made of opus cemeterium, a mixture of volcanic sand called pozzolana, lime, and water. Pozzolana was a special type of volcanic ash that came from the eruption of Mount Vesuvius in Italy. It was highly effective in strengthening mortar and making it waterproof. So the Romans used it in many of their buildings, including their houses. The Romans would compact each layer of the foundation with a rammer, a heavy tool that they used to compact the soil and make it firm. They would repeat this process until the foundation was high enough to support the weight of the house. Step 3. Erecting the walls. Once the foundation was solid and level, the Romans could start building the walls of the house. The materials they used depended on the region and the availability of resources. In some places, they used mud bricks called laters, which were made of clay, straw, and water. In other places, they used stones that they quarried and shaped themselves. The Romans were skilled builders and they knew how to work with both materials. They made their bricks by hand, pressing the clay mixture into wooden molds, then drying them in the sun and stacking them with mortar. They made their stone walls by cutting and shaping the stones with hammers and chisels, then fitting them together precisely. They used a special mortar for the brick walls called opus lateritium, which was made of small pebbles and lime. They applied the mortar with a trowel-like tool called a trulla and smoothed it over the bricks. They also used a watertight mortar called opus cementitium for the stone walls, which was made of pozzolana, lime, and water. They used a different tool called a matta for applying and smoothing the mortar on the stones. The Romans built their walls carefully layer by layer, making sure that the stones or bricks were aligned and level. They also made sure that the mortar was strong and durable. The thickness of the walls varied depending on their height. Typically, the lower courses of the walls were thicker than the upper courses. The Romans also made sure to leave openings for doors and windows. They made the door and window frames from wood using saws, chisels, and adzes. An adze is a tool similar to an axe, but it has a blade that is set horizontally. The Romans used it for shaping and smoothing wood. They also placed horizontal wooden beams or stone lintels above the openings to support the weight of the roof and prevent the walls from collapsing. The Romans used a simple system of braces and pulleys to lift the beams into place. Step 4. Building roof supports and framework. After the walls were finished, the Romans could start building the roof supports and framework. They prepared the wood beams using axes called securus and saws called serra. A securus was a double-edged axe with a short handle that the Romans used for shaping and notching wood. A serra was a type of saw with a wooden frame and metal blades that the Romans used for cutting wood. They used these tools to cut and shape the beams according to their length and width requirements. Then they laid the beams across the walls to form a sturdy framework for the roof. The spacing of the beams depended on the size of the roof tiles, but typically they were between 60 and 90 centimeters apart. The Romans also used wooden posts either in the center or at regular intervals along the walls to support the roof and increase its lifespan. These posts were usually placed every 2 to 3 meters and were anchored to the foundation with metal brackets. They also dug channels in the roof beams where they placed the posts so they could fit tightly and firmly. To make the joints stronger, the Romans used wooden pegs, long and thick pieces of wood that they inserted into the holes made in the beams and posts. They made sure that the pegs were smooth and tight to prevent them from twisting or moving. They also sealed the joints with resin, a sticky substance that came from pine trees and other conifers. The resin hardened when exposed to air and created a water-resistant seal. The Romans also left space between the beams and posts for installing gutters, which were wooden channels that directed rainwater away from the house. Step 5 of roofing. Once the roof framework was complete, the Romans could start laying the roof tiles. The roof tiles were made of clay, specifically a type of terracotta called tegulae and imbrices. The Romans made the tegulae by hand, shaping them into flat rectangular pieces that looked like large plates. The imbrices, on the other hand, were made by molding, a technique in which clay was forced through a machine that had a specific shape. The tiles were then dried in the sun for several days until they were hard and waterproof. To install the tiles, the Romans started from one edge of the roof and worked their way across, placing them side by side and overlapping them to form a continuous covering. They used a wooden batten, a thin strip of wood that served as a starting point for the first tile row. They also used a wooden hammer to tap the tiles into place and make sure they were level. The Romans also installed a layer of wooden strips called pans between the roof tiles and the beams to create a ventilation gap and prevent moisture from accumulating under the tiles. They also used a type of mortar called opus signinum to seal the joints between the tiles and make the roof waterproof. The opus signinum was made of a mixture of crushed pottery or tiles, lime and water. They applied it with a special tool called a pugnus, which was like a small trowel. They also used a metal rake to remove excess mortar and make sure the roof looked neat. Step 6, flooring. Before laying the floor, the Romans would prepare the ground by leveling and compacting it. They would remove any vegetation, rocks or other debris that could affect the quality of the floor. They would then add a layer of sand or gravel to create a drainage layer that would allow water to escape and prevent it from accumulating underneath the floor. They would also use a raking or leveling tool to make the surface as flat and smooth as possible. For the actual flooring, the Romans had several options to choose from depending on their budget and taste. They could make a floor from packed earth, a simple and cheap option that consisted of compacting the soil with a rammer. They could also use a mixture of small stones, brick fragments or concrete called opus signinum. The opus signinum was made of a mixture of crushed pottery or tiles, lime and water. They would apply it with a special tool called a pugnus, which was like a small trowel. They would also use a metal rake to remove excess mortar and make sure the floor looked neat. Wealthier Romans might opt for floors made of mosaic tiles that were arranged in intricate patterns or designs. Step 7, finishing. After the floors were laid, the Romans could start finishing the interior of the house. One of the first things they would do is plaster the interior walls with a type of stucco called intonico. The intonico was made of a mixture of lime and fine sand that was applied to the walls using a special tool called a malleus, which was like a small hammer. They would also use a metal float to smooth the surface of the plaster and make it level. The Romans might also decorate the interior walls with frescoes, which were paintings done on wet plaster. They would mix the colors with water and apply them with a brush or a sponge. They would also use a type of wash called encaustic painting, in which they mixed the colors with hot wax and applied them with a brush. Step 8, installing fixtures and furniture. After the walls and floors were finished, the Romans could start installing the fixtures and furniture in their new house. They would use nails, wooden pegs and iron fittings to secure doors, shutters and other interior fixtures. They would also craft basic furniture from wood using traditional tools such as saws, chisels, and hammers. For example, they might make benches, shelves, and tables that would match the style and function of their house. Step 9, final touches and exterior finishing. After all the interior work was completed, the Romans could start working on the exterior of the house. One of the final touches they would add is a coat of plaster mixed with crushed brick or stone powder to protect the walls from rain and wind. They would apply the coating using a special tool called a malleus, which was like a small hammer. They would also use a metal float to smooth the surface of the coating and make it level. The Romans might also decorate the exterior of the house with frescoes, which were paintings done on wet plaster. They would mix the colors with water and apply them with a brush or a sponge. The Romans also might landscape the area around the home, though it wasn't common for them to have large gardens or elaborate designs. They might add some gravel or a paved pathway to help with drainage and easy access to the home. If you liked this video, give us a thumbs up and share it with your friends. And don't forget to subscribe so you can get notified whenever we post a new video. And now over to you. What did you find most interesting about the way ancient Romans built houses? Let us know in the comments below. And if you have any suggestions for future videos, please let us know there too. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Thanks for watching.